Beneath the alluvial plains of southern Iraq, archaeologists have uncovered layers of clay and silt that do not belong to any known city, any named king, or any recorded dynasty. At sites like Eridu and Ur, beneath temples and foundations long attributed to the earliest Sumerians, there are traces of habitation that appear older than the stories meant to explain them. Fired mud brick fragments without inscriptions, water-worn soil suggesting prolonged inundation. Shrines rebuilt again and again on the same sacred ground, as if memory itself refused to let the place disappear. The cuneiform tablets that survived these landscapes speak carefully. They record gods, lineages, and cities, yet they also pause, briefly, deliberately, before the arrival of the Anunnaki. In those pauses, time seems to stretch. The texts describe a world already ordered, already alive, before divine names settled into hierarchies. Freshwater abysses, sacred mounds, laws that existed before rulers, and silence before command. These are not myths inserted casually. They are fragments preserved by scribes who chose not to explain everything. And that is where the unease begins. What kind of world required no kings, yet still possessed order? Why do the oldest records insist that civilization did not begin with humanity, but with something earlier, something now absent? Were these memories symbolic, geological, theological, or something more difficult to classify? And what might have been lost when history was later arranged into cleaner sequences, clearer origins, and safer beginnings? Tonight, we will move slowly through those questions. We will listen to the spaces between lines, to the weight of what is implied rather than stated. We will follow the records not to certainty, but to the edges of understanding, where archaeology, myth, and silence overlap. Welcome to Cryptic Realm Channel. If these journeys into obscured history bring you calm, curiosity, or reflection, consider subscribing and joining us again. Now, as the night deepens, let us begin to trace what the Sumerian records suggest existed before the Anunnaki arrived, and why those traces still refuse to fade. The land between the rivers does not announce its age easily. At first glance, the plains of southern Mesopotamia appear flat, exposed, almost fragile. Thin stretches of earth shaped by wind, water, and long abandonment. Yet beneath that surface lies a depth that resists simplification. Long before bricks were stacked into temples and names pressed into clay, this landscape already carried memory. The rivers did not carve an empty world. They flowed through a place that had already learned how to hold water, how to settle silt, how to sustain life without walls or kings. Archaeological layers tell this story quietly. Beneath the earliest known Sumerian cities, excavators found older soils, darkened by reeds, compacted by slow seasonal flooding, shaped not by urban planning, but by rhythm. These layers suggest wetlands rather than streets, fishing camps rather than palaces, movement rather than permanence. The people who lived here left few durable objects behind, and that absence itself becomes evidence. They built lightly, as if the land were not something to be claimed, but something to be passed through. Their world did not require monumental architecture to feel ordered. Later scribes seemed to remember this. In the oldest Sumerian texts, before gods speak and kings rule, there is a recurring emphasis on water, fresh water specifically. The Abzu, described not as chaos but as a sustaining depth, appears again and again as the source from which structure emerges. This is not the violent creation seen in other mythologies. There is no battle to impose order. Instead, there is emergence, separation, gradual differentiation. The language suggests a world that organized itself long before authority arrived to manage it. Such descriptions align uneasily with conventional timelines. If the earliest cities formed around 3500 BCE, why do the records insist on an earlier order that was already complete in its own way? Why do they describe laws, measures, and balances existing before rulers were appointed to enforce them? Some scholars interpret this as symbolic, a poetic way of expressing natural harmony. Others note how often these passages are placed deliberately before the arrival of the Anunnaki, as if marking a boundary between two modes of existence. The boundary matters. Once the Anunnaki appear, the tone shifts. Labor becomes defined. Roles are assigned. The land is divided, measured, optimized. What was once sustained through seasonal knowledge becomes managed through command. The earlier world does not vanish entirely, but it recedes. It survives as memory rather than practice, referenced but no longer accessible. The records never say it was destroyed. They only imply that it ended. Geology offers its own quiet commentary. Core samples taken from the Persian Gulf and lower Mesopotamian basin reveal periods of rapid environmental change. Rising waters, shifting coastlines, expanding marshlands. These were not sudden cataclysms, but slow transformations that would have favored flexible lifeways over fixed settlements. A society adapted to movement and water could endure such changes without collapse. A society invested in permanence would struggle, and so a question forms, gently but insistently. Was the world before the Anunnaki remembered as sacred because it was simpler, or because it was lost? Did later civilizations look back on it with reverence because it represented harmony, or because it reminded them of something they could no longer live without hierarchy to maintain? The tablets do not answer. They merely preserve the outline of a different beginning, waiting for us to notice what is missing before the story of gods and cities truly begins. Memory in this landscape does not behave like a straight line. It pools, recedes, and resurfaces in places that logic alone cannot fully explain. When the earliest Sumerian scribes described beginnings, they did not start with people. They started with conditions, with water held in balance, with land that knew when to appear and when to disappear. This choice was not accidental. It suggests that, for those who wrote the first tablets, the world itself was already functioning long before names and lineages were assigned. In the oldest cosmological passages, creation unfolds without urgency. The Abzu is not portrayed as a threat to be overcome, but as a stable depth, fresh water beneath the earth, feeding springs, marshes, and life at the surface. It is a reservoir of continuity rather than disorder. In practical terms, this reflects something archaeologists have long observed in the southern marshes: an environment capable of sustaining human communities without large-scale agriculture or permanent architecture. Fishing, reed gathering, seasonal planting, and boat travel formed an economy that depended more on observation than control. Material traces support this interpretation. Early tools recovered from pre-urban layers are modest and adaptable. Bone points, simple blades, net weights fashioned from stone or clay. There is little evidence of surplus accumulation or defensive construction. No walls, no weapons designed for organized conflict. This absence is striking, not because it indicates lack of sophistication, but because it suggests a different priority. Survival did not require domination. It required alignment. The texts appear to remember this alignment as something fragile. When later scribes looked back, they did not describe this earlier world as primitive. They described it as complete. Measures existed before rulers. Boundaries existed before property. Even justice is described as present before courts were built. These are not details added casually. They imply that order was once embedded in the environment itself, rather than imposed through authority. The shift comes quietly in the records, almost reluctantly. Divine figures begin to appear not as creators of the world, but as administrators of it. The Anunnaki do not arrive to bring existence into being. They arrive to manage what is already there. Tasks are assigned, labor is defined, time becomes segmented, days are counted, work replaces rhythm. This transformation is presented as necessary, but never as entirely beneficial. Some scholars have noted how this mirrors a broader human transition. As climate stabilized after the last glacial period, populations grew. Fixed settlements became advantageous. Irrigation required coordination. Coordination required leadership. Leadership required systems that could outlast individuals. In this view, the Anunnaki represent not external beings, but the personification of systemic complexity. Forces that emerge when societies cross a certain threshold. Yet the records resist being reduced to metaphor alone. They insist on a before that was different in kind, not merely in scale. A time when the land itself carried the burden of order, and human intervention remained minimal. A time remembered not for its achievements, but for its balance. That memory persists like an echo, surfacing whenever later systems falter. Environmental evidence adds weight to this unease. Sediment layers show cycles of expansion and contraction in the marshlands, suggesting periods when centralized control would have been difficult to maintain. In such conditions, decentralized knowledge would outperform rigid systems. A society attuned to subtle shifts could adapt without collapse. One reliant on fixed infrastructure could not. So the question deepens. Was the arrival of the Anunnaki a solution to growing complexity, or a response to the loss of an earlier equilibrium? Did order need to be enforced because it no longer arose naturally? And if so, what does that imply about the cost of civilization itself? The tablets do not condemn the change. They simply mark it. They preserve the memory of a world that functioned without hierarchy, and then they move on, as if aware that something essential had been left behind, something that could be remembered, but never fully recovered once the work of the gods began. The records become more careful at this point, as if the scribes themselves sensed the weight of what they were describing. When the Anunnaki begin to appear by name, they do not enter a void. They step into a world already shaped, already functioning, already sustained by patterns that did not require oversight. This detail is easy to overlook, yet it alters everything that follows. The Anunnaki are introduced not as originators, but as inheritors of a system that predates their authority. Their earliest descriptions are restrained. They are not immediately rulers or conquerors. They are forces of allocation. Each is associated with a domain that already exists: sky, wind, water, earth, not as creators of these elements, but as stewards assigned to manage them. The language used in the tablets suggests division rather than invention. Responsibilities are distributed, jurisdictions defined. The world, once continuous, begins to fracture into roles. This is where labor first enters the story with clarity. Before this moment, effort is implied but not formalized. Fishing, gathering, tending reeds, these acts are woven into life without being named as obligations. After the arrival of the Anunnaki, work becomes explicit. It is measured, repeated, and recorded. The land is no longer something one moves with, it becomes something one works upon. The rivers, once allowed to wander, are guided. Channels are cut. Floods are anticipated and restrained. Archaeology mirrors this shift. The earliest irrigation systems in southern Mesopotamia appear suddenly sophisticated, requiring planning beyond a single season. Canals had to be maintained, embankments reinforced, schedules coordinated. This kind of infrastructure does not emerge gradually. It requires a conceptual leap, a willingness to subordinate individual rhythms to collective demands. The tablets encode this transition not as progress, but as necessity. Yet necessity carries consequence. The texts introduce a new tension, subtle but persistent. The Igigi appear in this phase, described as divine laborers tasked with sustaining the newly organized world. They dig canals, they maintain order. Over time, they grow weary. Their exhaustion is not physical alone. It is existential. They remember implicitly a time before work was endless, before maintenance replaced harmony. This memory surfaces in the narrative not as rebellion at first, but as strain. The gods themselves begin to experience the cost of the system they oversee. The world has become productive, but brittle. It requires constant input to avoid collapse. When the Igigi finally protest, their uprising is framed not as chaos, but as refusal, a rejection of unending labor in service of a structure that no longer sustains itself naturally. Some scholars interpret this episode as a mythic reflection of early social stratification. As human societies grew, labor burdens shifted downward. That which was once shared became assigned. Those tasked with maintenance bore the cost, while those who organized benefited from stability. The rebellion of the Igigi echoes a recurring pattern in human history. Systems built to manage complexity eventually strain those who keep them running. The Anunnaki respond not by dismantling the system, but by seeking a substitute. The solution they devise, creating humanity as a laboring intermediary, reveals how far the world has moved from its earlier state. Instead of adapting to the land, a new being will adapt to the system. Clay mixed with divine essence, according to the texts, becomes the material through which order is preserved. What is striking is how little celebration accompanies this creation. Humanity is not described as a triumph, but as a compromise, a means to preserve a structure that can no longer sustain itself without constant effort. In this light, the arrival of humans marks not the beginning of civilization, but its maintenance phase, and beneath it all, the earlier world remains unaddressed. It is not mourned openly, it is not restored. It simply stops being mentioned in practical terms. The marshes recede, the rhythms fade. What was once held by the land is now carried by beings shaped to endure work and forget balance. This raises an unsettling possibility. If the Anunnaki did not create order, but replaced a different kind of order with management, then civilization begins not with enlightenment, but with loss. And if humanity was born to stabilize that loss, what exactly were we asked to forget in the process? Something subtle happens after humanity enters the record. The language slows. Descriptions become heavier, more procedural, as if the story itself has accepted a new gravity. Where earlier passages spoke of waters, separations, and balances, the tablets now concern themselves with quotas, obligations, and outcomes. This change is not dramatic, yet it is unmistakable. The world has moved from being observed to being managed, and with that shift comes a narrowing of attention. Human beings are introduced not through childhood or growth, but through function. They are shaped to work, to endure repetition, to shoulder the burden that even divine beings could no longer sustain indefinitely. The clay from which they are formed is not raw earth alone, but earth mixed with something sacrificed, often described as divine blood or essence. Scholars have long debated whether this imagery reflects ritual symbolism, early understandings of heredity, or social metaphors of obligation. What remains clear is that humanity enters the story already indebted to a system older than itself. Daily life begins to change accordingly. The tablets describe fixed settlements, measured fields, assigned roles. Houses cluster near canals. Storage facilities appear, signaling surplus and planning beyond immediate need. With surplus comes hierarchy. With hierarchy comes enforcement. Archaeological remains from early Sumerian sites show this transition materially. Standardized bricks, repeated architectural forms, seal impressions used to mark ownership or authority. Identity becomes something that can be impressed, recorded, transferred. Yet this new stability carries a quiet cost. The environment, once a collaborator, becomes a variable to be controlled. Floods are no longer seasonal gifts, they are threats. Droughts are no longer endured, they are failures of management. The land's unpredictability, once accepted, now demands explanation and correction. Rituals proliferate not simply to honor forces, but to appease them, to keep the system functioning. The Anunnaki, in this phase, recede from direct labor and move fully into governance. They issue decrees, they establish laws. The ME, those foundational principles that govern everything from craftsmanship to kingship, are gathered, guarded, redistributed. What once flowed freely through the structure of existence becomes centralized. Knowledge itself begins to concentrate. Some scholars suggest that this mirrors the rise of priestly classes and administrative elites in early Mesopotamia. Literacy becomes specialized. Writing shifts from ritual expression to accounting. Clay tablets multiply not to tell stories, but to track grain, labor, and exchange. The sacred and the bureaucratic intertwine until they are difficult to separate. Authority now speaks in the language of inevitability, yet the memory of what came before does not vanish entirely. It lingers in hymns, in laments, in the peculiar reverence for ruins. Even as cities rise, the oldest temples are built on ancient mounds, places already considered sacred long before bricks were stacked. Eridu especially is remembered as having existed before kingship descended from the heavens. This detail appears again and again, quietly undermining the idea that civilization began with rule. Geological evidence reinforces this tension. Sediment layers beneath early cities show repeated flooding events that would have disrupted centralized control. Each rebuilding suggests persistence, but also vulnerability. The more complex the system becomes, the more fragile it grows. Maintenance replaces resilience. Adaptation gives way to preservation. In this context, humanity's role becomes clearer and more troubling. Humans are not created to explore or to flourish freely, but to absorb instability, to become the flexible component in an inflexible system. Their shorter lifespans, emphasized repeatedly in later texts, ensure turnover. Memory fades. What must be maintained is renewed not through understanding, but through repetition. And so the earlier world, fluid, adaptive, largely unrecorded, becomes inaccessible not because it was destroyed, but because the conditions that supported it no longer exist. Order has been externalized. Balance has been outsourced to systems that require constant input. This invites a final unease to settle in. If humanity was shaped to sustain a world already drifting from its original equilibrium, then perhaps the oldest loss recorded in the Sumerian tablets is not divine withdrawal or catastrophic flood, but the quiet forgetting of how to live within limits without being commanded to do so. Time, once implied, now becomes measured. This change is easy to miss because it does not arrive with ceremony. It arrives with counting. Days are divided. Seasons are named with precision. The moon is no longer only a presence in the night sky, but a regulator of obligation. Calendars emerge not to mark wonder, but to synchronize labor, ritual, and expectation. The world tightens around these divisions, and the human experience tightens with it. The tablets reflect this narrowing through repetition. Lists multiply, kings are named in sequence, reigns are counted in years rather than remembered through deeds. Even the distant past is reorganized to fit this structure. Antediluvian rulers are assigned impossibly long reigns, stretching tens of thousands of years, not as historical claims in the modern sense, but as a signal that time itself once behaved differently. Before the current order, duration was expansive. After it, life contracts. This contrast is not explained. It is simply preserved. The scribes record that kingship descended from the heavens after a great rupture, but they rarely dwell on what that descent replaced. The earlier world becomes something that can only be referenced indirectly, through exaggeration and reverence. Lengthened lifespans, immense wisdom, effortless abundance. These motifs suggest not fantasy, but distance. A way of acknowledging that something fundamental has shifted beyond recovery. Archaeology offers a parallel perspective. Early urban layers show increasing standardization. Tools made to uniform sizes, weights calibrated, spaces regulated. This efficiency supports growth, yet it also signals a loss of variation. Where earlier communities adjusted locally, cities now impose coherence across larger populations. Diversity gives way to scale, and scale requires enforcement. With enforcement comes punishment. Legal codes begin to appear, carved into stone and clay. They promise order, but they also reveal anxiety. Theft, disobedience, negligence. These behaviors are named because they have become threats to stability. In a world once governed by environmental rhythm, such transgressions required little response. In a world governed by systems, they cannot be tolerated. The Anunnaki preside over this transformation as guarantors of continuity. Their authority becomes less visible, but more absolute. They no longer walk among humans frequently. Instead, they speak through omens, dreams, and intermediaries. This distance is important. It preserves their position while removing them from accountability. When floods come or harvests fail, the fault lies not with the system, but with human error or moral lapse. Yet beneath these explanations, older memories persist. Flood narratives recur across Mesopotamian literature, each time emphasizing not just destruction, but excess. Too much water, too much noise, too much humanity. The gods complain not of evil, but of disturbance. The world has become loud, unstable, difficult to regulate. The response is always reduction, famine, plague, deluge, reset rather than reflection. Geological studies confirm that large-scale flooding did occur in the region, though not as a single global event. Rivers shifted, marshes expanded, settlements were abandoned and rebuilt. For societies dependent on fixed infrastructure, such changes would have been catastrophic. For earlier, mobile communities, they would have been survivable. This distinction matters because it suggests that disaster becomes fatal only after adaptability is surrendered. The Sumerian records seem aware of this, even if they cannot articulate it directly. They frame catastrophe as divine decision, yet they preserve the memory of a time when catastrophe was not required to restore balance. The implication is subtle, but persistent. Something about the new order has made collapse inevitable, or at least periodic. Humanity's place within this cycle grows increasingly ambiguous. Humans are both beneficiaries and buffers. They receive knowledge, tools, and structure, yet they also absorb punishment meant to quiet the system. Their mortality, once a biological condition, becomes a functional necessity. Short lives prevent accumulation of memory deep enough to challenge the order that depends on forgetting, and so time itself becomes an instrument. By shortening human lives and lengthening institutional memory, the system ensures continuity without comprehension. The past is preserved as record, not as lived possibility. This raises a quiet, unsettling thought. If the earliest Sumerian texts remember a world before measured time, before enforced order, before delegated labor, then perhaps the most profound change introduced by the Anunnaki was not technology or governance, but the redefinition of time itself, and with it, the narrowing of what human life could be allowed to remember. As time becomes constrained, memory begins to fracture. The tablets grow more confident in their claims, yet less reflective in their tone. Where earlier passages lingered on conditions and balances, later ones insist on outcomes. This shift suggests not greater clarity, but a narrowing of acceptable explanation. History is no longer a space for uncertainty. It becomes a sequence that must justify the present order. The idea of destiny enters quietly. Not as a philosophical abstraction, but as an administrative reality. The future is spoken of as something already determined, already written, waiting to unfold according to established measures. Omens are read not to explore possibility, but to confirm inevitability. When signs are unfavorable, rituals are performed to correct deviation rather than to reconsider direction. The system protects itself by interpreting all variants as error. This approach reshapes how knowledge is treated. The ME, once described as distributed principles embedded in existence, are now depicted as objects that can be possessed, transferred, hidden, or stolen. Wisdom becomes portable, but also vulnerable. The famous myths of stolen ME, where divine figures deceive one another to gain control over arts, crafts, and social order, carry an undercurrent of anxiety. If knowledge can be moved, then it can also be withheld. If it can be centralized, it can be weaponized. Archaeological evidence mirrors this concentration. Temples expand into complexes, storehouses multiply. Writing becomes more specialized, confined to trained scribes whose education spans years. Literacy ceases to be communal and becomes institutional. What was once shared through practice is now mediated through symbols that only a few can interpret. This creates continuity, but also distance. The population lives within a system it can no longer fully read. The Anunnaki, in this environment, function less as beings and more as guarantors of abstraction. They embody order so that order itself does not have to be questioned. When inconsistencies arise, crop failures, social unrest, disease, the explanation returns to divine displeasure or human failure, never to systemic design. The gods become shields behind which structure hides, yet cracks appear even within the texts. Laments surface, long, mournful compositions describing ruined cities, abandoned temples, and gods who have turned away. These are not rare or marginal. They form a substantial genre of Mesopotamian literature. In them, destruction is not portrayed as deserved. It is portrayed as bewildering. Priests plead, cities weep, rivers overflow their banks as if grieving. The tone suggests confusion rather than guilt. Such laments imply that even those closest to the system sensed its instability. They knew how carefully everything had been arranged and how easily it could unravel. The more complex the structure became, the more catastrophic its failures. Recovery was possible, but never complete. Each rebuilding carried more rules, more oversight, more distance from the rhythms that once sustained life without intervention. Environmental studies add a further layer to this unease. Pollen analysis and sediment records indicate episodes of salinization in southern Mesopotamia. Soil gradually poisoned by irrigation practices that brought salt to the surface. Yields declined. Fields were abandoned. The very techniques that enabled urban growth undermined long-term fertility. This was not a sudden disaster, but a slow degradation, difficult to perceive until damage was advanced. The texts do not name salinization, but they speak of lands that no longer respond, of gods withdrawing favor, of abundance turning unreliable. The language of myth absorbs the consequences of engineering. What could not be acknowledged as error becomes framed as fate. Humanity's role within this process grows increasingly tragic. Created to stabilize the system, humans now bear the cost of its limitations. They labor harder as yields decline. They pray more fervently as outcomes worsen. Their suffering is interpreted as moral failing rather than structural exhaustion. This interpretation ensures obedience, but at the cost of insight. And still, beneath the layers of explanation, the memory of the earlier world persists. It appears in dreams, in hymns, in the persistent sanctity of water sources and ancient mounds. It is remembered not as a place to return to, but as a reference point, a reminder that life once required less control to endure. This tension remains unresolved. The records move forward, but they do not fully silence the past. They carry within them a quiet contradiction, a civilization devoted to order, haunted by the knowledge that order itself may have been the departure from something more resilient. Silence becomes meaningful where explanation no longer satisfies. In the later layers of the Sumerian record, there are moments when the narrative slows, not to clarify, but to hesitate. These pauses do not announce themselves as doubts, yet they carry the weight of something unspoken. The scribes continue to write, to copy, to preserve. But what they preserve increasingly feels like an echo rather than a living memory. One of the most revealing shifts occurs in how space is described. Early passages speak of land as fluid, marsh, river, boundary that moves with the season. Later texts describe territory as fixed, named, claimed. Borders harden. Cities define themselves not only by what they contain, but by what they exclude. Walls rise, first as flood defenses, then as symbols of separation. What was once open becomes enclosed, and enclosure reshapes how danger is understood. Conflict emerges more clearly in this phase, not as mythic struggle, but as organized violence. Weapons appear in the archaeological record with increasing frequency. Spearheads standardized for mass production, fortifications planned with geometry rather than improvisation. The presence of such tools suggests anticipation, not reaction. War becomes something to prepare for, not merely endure. This anticipation reveals a loss of trust in nature, in neighbors, in the systems meant to guarantee stability. The Anunnaki remain present in the background of these developments, yet their role feels increasingly ceremonial. They are invoked to legitimize authority, to sanctify conquest, to explain victory and defeat. Their earlier function as managers of balance fades, replaced by their use as symbols of inevitability. When cities fall, it is said to be their will. When empires rise, it is said to be their favor. In both cases, human agency becomes obscured. This obscuring has consequences for how history is remembered. Events are recorded, but causes are simplified. Complexity is compressed into moral narratives. Obedience leads to prosperity, disobedience to ruin. Such frameworks are effective for control, but they erase nuance. They leave little room to acknowledge that systems themselves may fail, regardless of devotion. Environmental strain continues to build beneath these narratives. Rivers shift course. Irrigation networks require constant repair. Fields lose productivity. These challenges demand innovation, yet innovation is constrained by tradition and ritual. Change becomes risky when legitimacy depends on continuity with the past. The system becomes trapped by its own need to appear unchanging. In this context, older stories take on new importance. Myths of a time before kingship, before cities, before enforced labor circulate with renewed intensity. They are not calls for return, but reminders of contrast. They suggest that another mode of existence once functioned without the structures now deemed indispensable. This suggestion is unsettling because it implies that current suffering is not the price of progress, but the result of choice. The Epic of Gilgamesh reflects this unease vividly. Gilgamesh, a king of immense power, is described as restless, unsatisfied, driven by an awareness that something essential is missing. His quest for immortality is often read as fear of death, but it can also be read as longing for continuity, the kind that once existed without monuments or decrees. His failure to attain it reinforces the boundary between the present order and what preceded it. What survives of the earlier world survives only as fragment and symbol. Sacred waters are revered. Ancient sites remain holy even when their original purpose is forgotten. Rituals preserve gestures whose meanings have thinned with repetition. These remnants are treated with respect, yet they are no longer integrated into daily life. They exist at the margins, honored but isolated. This marginalization is telling. It suggests that the system cannot fully accommodate the memory of what came before without undermining itself. To remember too clearly would invite comparison, and comparison would invite questioning. And questioning, once allowed, could loosen the structures that depend on certainty. And so the silence persists. The tablets continue, the cities endure, the gods are praised. But beneath the continuity lies a fracture, a quiet awareness that something foundational was exchanged for order, and that the exchange cannot be reversed without cost. The story moves forward, yet it carries within it the unresolved tension between what is maintained and what was relinquished, waiting for the moment when that tension can no longer remain buried. The pressure of that buried tension begins to surface in how the records treat decline. When cities weaken or vanish, the explanations offered grow increasingly abstract. The gods are said to have withdrawn their favor. Destiny is said to have turned. Rarely is the material cause examined directly. Yet the material traces remain, scattered beneath the ruins, collapsed canals, abandoned fields, layers of wind-blown dust that speak of exhaustion rather than punishment. In several Sumerian city laments, destruction is described not as a single blow, but as a gradual unraveling. Temples fall silent before they fall apart. Offerings diminish. Priests continue rituals even as the population thins. The language suggests disbelief more than guilt. These cities had followed the rules. They had maintained the system. And still, the order they depended on began to fail them. This failure forces a subtle shift in perspective. The past, once organized into neat sequences of reigns and decrees, starts to feel unreliable. Scribes copy older texts with increasing reverence, as if the authority they seek no longer exists in the present. Lists of kings grow longer, more formal, yet less connected to lived experience. The act of recording becomes an act of preservation rather than understanding. In this environment, the earliest memories take on renewed significance. References to the time before kingship appear again, not as origins, but as contrast. The phrase itself, before kingship, defines the present by what it lacks. It implies that authority, once unnecessary, has become indispensable, and that this dependence is itself a vulnerability. Some scholars have suggested that these references reflect social nostalgia, a common response during periods of instability. But the persistence and specificity of the memory suggest something deeper. The texts do not describe the earlier world as chaotic or incomplete. They describe it as sufficient. That distinction matters. It implies that the introduction of hierarchy was not a correction of disorder, but a response to changing conditions. Conditions that may have been temporary, misread, or overcorrected. The role of the Anunnaki shifts accordingly. They are still present, still invoked, but their earlier clarity fades. They become distant, sometimes contradictory. One god's command undermines another's intention. Councils of gods argue, hesitate, revise decisions. This portrayal erodes the image of a unified, all-knowing authority. It suggests that even at the highest level, certainty has fractured. This fragmentation mirrors the human experience beneath it. Cities compete rather than cooperate. Alliances shift. Warfare becomes cyclical. Diplomacy grows more complex, reliant on treaties that must be renewed constantly. Trust erodes. Stability becomes something to defend rather than something that arises naturally. Environmental data reinforces this narrative. Evidence of prolonged droughts and fluctuating river patterns during the late 3rd millennium BCE indicates stress beyond any single city's control. Yet the response remains consistent. More regulation, more ritual, more appeals to divine order. Adaptation gives way to insistence. The system tightens precisely when flexibility is most needed. Within this tightening, the memory of the earlier world becomes increasingly dangerous. It represents not just an alternative past, but an alternative logic, one in which balance emerged from attentiveness rather than enforcement. To acknowledge that such a world once existed is to admit that the current order is not inevitable, and so the memory is contained. It is framed as myth. It is placed beyond reach, before time itself was measured. It is honored, but rendered impractical. This containment allows the present to continue without confronting its own contingency. Yet containment is never absolute. The memory resurfaces in moments of collapse, when systems fail and explanations fall short. In those moments, the question returns, quietly but persistently. If the world once functioned without this much control, then what exactly was gained and what was lost? When authority replaced alignment, the records do not answer. They move forward, cataloging decline and recovery in equal measure. But beneath the movement lies a stillness, a sense that the story of civilization is not only about ascent and fall, but about a choice made long ago, whose consequences continue to unfold, unresolved beneath every attempt to restore order. By this stage, the story has learned how to disguise its own discomfort. What once appeared as hesitation now presents itself as tradition. Practices that emerged as responses to crisis are repeated long after their original purpose has faded, preserved because they feel ancient, not because they remain effective. Continuity becomes its own justification. To question it would be to admit that the past is not a stable foundation, but a layered accumulation of choices. The Sumerian scribes seem acutely aware of this fragility. Their insistence on copying older texts word for word, even when meanings were no longer clear, suggests a fear of loss deeper than mere historical interest. These were not casual records. They were anchors. In a world where cities rose and fell with unsettling regularity, the written word became a way to hold something still, even if what was being held no longer fit the present. This is particularly evident in the treatment of divine law. The ME, once described as principles woven into existence, are now guarded objects, stored in temples, transported in ritual processions, invoked to legitimize authority. Their number grows, their scope expands. What began as a way of naming natural balance becomes an exhaustive catalogue of human behavior. Art, war, love, kingship, deception, lamentation, all are assigned divine sanction. Nothing is left unclassified. Such completeness gives the appearance of control, yet it also reveals anxiety. A system that must define everything leaves little room for ambiguity, and ambiguity is where adaptation begins. The earlier world, remembered only faintly, operated within ambiguity. It relied on observation, adjustment, restraint. The later world replaces these with decree and repetition. Political power consolidates alongside this shift. Kings present themselves not merely as rulers, but as intermediaries between humanity and the divine order. Their authority rests on alignment with the gods, not consent of the governed. Inscriptions emphasize obedience, piety, correct ritual performance. Success is framed as proof of divine favor. Failure becomes evidence of transgression, even when causes are structural or environmental. Military expansion accelerates within this framework. Campaigns are recorded with precision. Enemy cities named, spoils counted, borders redrawn. Violence is no longer episodic. It becomes strategic. The logic is familiar. Expansion secures resources. Resources sustain the system. The system validates expansion. Yet each conquest introduces new variables, new populations, new strains. Stability is pursued through accumulation, not balance. Archaeological layers reveal the cost. Cities grow denser. Sanitation struggles to keep pace. Disease spreads more easily. Food distribution becomes uneven. These pressures do not appear suddenly, but they compound. The system responds as it always has, with more structure. Bureaucracy thickens, oversight multiplies. The distance between decision and consequence widens. In this widening gap, the human experience becomes increasingly abstracted. Individuals are counted as labor units, soldiers, dependents. Their lives are measured against quotas and obligations. The earlier intimacy between community and environment fades further. Rivers are no longer companions but variables in equations of yield and risk. When they behave unpredictably, the response is frustration rather than understanding. The Anunnaki, once central figures in the story, now feel almost incidental. Their names remain, their temples stand, their rituals continue, yet they function more as symbols than participants. They legitimize the system, but they do not guide it. The narrative has become self-sustaining, driven by its own momentum. Even the gods appear bound by the order they once administered. This is perhaps the most telling transformation. Authority, initially introduced to manage complexity, becomes constrained by that same complexity. The divine councils argue, hesitate, contradict themselves. Decisions are revised. Catastrophes are followed by regret. The image of omniscience fractures. What remains is not certainty, but inertia. And still, beneath this inertia, the earlier world persists as an absence that shapes everything around it. It is never described in full, yet it exerts pressure through contrast. Every regulation implies a freedom once lost. Every boundary implies a time before division. Every lament for a fallen city echoes a deeper lament for a way of living that did not require constant repair. The story does not stop here. It continues, as it must, toward greater consolidation and greater vulnerability. But at this point, a realization begins to surface, quietly and without resolution. If the systems designed to preserve order now struggle under their own weight, then perhaps the earliest loss was not land or memory, but trust. Trust in the world's capacity to sustain itself without being endlessly controlled. What follows is not collapse yet, but a tightening that feels like preparation. The records begin to speak more often of vigilance, of watching the skies, of reading the entrails of animals, of listening for messages embedded in wind and fire. Divination expands. not because the future has grown clearer, but because uncertainty has become intolerable. When systems strain, prediction becomes a form of comfort. This growing dependence on signs reveals a subtle inversion. Earlier, knowledge arose from participation in the world, by noticing when waters rose, when birds migrated, when soil changed texture beneath bare feet. Now, knowledge is extracted through ritualized interpretation. The natural world is no longer trusted to communicate plainly. It must be decoded by specialists. Meaning is filtered through authority. Astronomical observation plays a central role in this shift. Temples align with stars. Planets are tracked with care. Celestial cycles are mapped and correlated with terrestrial events. This is often celebrated as scientific advancement, and in many ways it is. Yet the purpose behind the observation matters. The heavens are not studied for wonder, but for warning. Eclipses become omens. Unusual alignments signal danger. The sky, once part of a continuous environment, becomes a screen onto which anxiety is projected. The priests who manage this knowledge gain influence accordingly. Their interpretations guide kings. Their calendars dictate labor and ritual alike. What they claim to read in the stars cannot easily be challenged, because it lies beyond ordinary experience. This distance between cause and effect strengthens hierarchy. Decisions are justified by reference to forces no one can verify directly. Meanwhile, the physical environment continues to change. Sediment studies suggest increasing aridity in some regions, while others suffer from repeated flooding. Irrigation systems extend farther, drawing water from sources less reliable than before. The land yields less predictably. Each failure demands explanation, and explanation increasingly takes moral form. Drought becomes a sign of impurity. Flood becomes punishment. Nature is no longer neutral, it is judgmental. This moralization of environment has consequences for social cohesion. When outcomes are framed as responses to behavior, communities turn inward, searching for fault. Unity fractures along lines of perceived devotion or transgression. Those who suffer most are often those with least power to influence policy, yet their suffering is read as evidence against them. The system protects itself by displacing responsibility downward. The Anunnaki preside over these interpretations as distant arbiters. Their will is invoked, but rarely questioned. In mythic councils, they argue among themselves, yet their decisions remain final. This portrayal reinforces a worldview in which authority, though fallible, is unavoidable. To challenge it would be to invite chaos, and yet chaos is already present, just rebranded. What once appeared as environmental fluctuation now manifests as social instability. Rebellions occur, cities refuse tribute, alliances break. Each disturbance is met with force or ritual, rarely with reflection on underlying causes. The cycle accelerates. Control breeds resistance. Resistance justifies more control. In this atmosphere, the earlier world becomes almost unbearable to contemplate. A time when balance emerged without surveillance, when adaptation replaced prediction, when authority was unnecessary because relationship sufficed. To remember such a world too clearly would expose the present as contingent rather than destined. So memory is managed carefully. It is wrapped in myth, placed beyond reach, assigned to an age when humans were different, when gods walked openly, when time itself behaved strangely. This framing protects the current order by making alternatives seem impossible. Yet the persistence of the memory suggests it serves another function as well. It offers a measure, a way of sensing how far the present has drifted from its own foundations. Every time the records speak of a world before kingship, before labor, before measured time, they invite comparison, even if they never encourage return. The question that begins to take shape is no longer about origins alone. It is about direction. If the systems built to secure stability now generate fragility, and if the memory of a different mode of existence refuses to fade, then what exactly is being preserved by maintaining the current order? The tablets do not resolve this. They continue forward, recording decisions and disasters with equal diligence. But the unease remains, growing quieter, deeper, more difficult to dismiss. It waits beneath the calculations and omens, beneath the rituals and walls, for the moment when the weight of control becomes heavier than the uncertainty it was meant to prevent. The weight does not fall all at once. It settles unevenly, pressing harder in some places than others, revealing fractures where the surface still appears intact. The records begin to reflect this unevenness through contradiction. Success and collapse are recorded side by side, sometimes within the same generation. One city thrives while another empties. One king boasts of abundance while another laments famine. The system no longer fails uniformly. It falters selectively. This selectivity changes how power is understood. Authority becomes mobile. When a city weakens, favor is said to move elsewhere. Kingship shifts location, as if legitimacy itself were a transferable substance rather than a social agreement. The Sumerian king list preserves this movement carefully, naming cities in sequence, as though stability could be maintained simply by relocating its center. Yet the frequency of these transfers increases over time, suggesting not resilience, but restlessness. Archaeological evidence supports this impression. Layers of occupation grow thinner in some regions, thicker in others. Urban centers expand rapidly, then contract just as quickly. Defensive structures become more prominent, even as trade networks stretch farther. This combination, greater connectivity paired with greater insecurity, creates a paradox. The world is more linked than ever, yet trust erodes. Every connection introduces vulnerability. Diplomacy emerges as a necessary art in this climate. Treaties are sworn before gods, sealed with offerings, recorded in clay. Language becomes cautious, formalized, filled with assurances that anticipate betrayal. The very need for such language reveals how fragile relationships have become. Cooperation is no longer assumed. It must be enforced through ritual and threat alike. The Anunnaki continue to hover above these arrangements as guarantors of oaths. Their presence sanctifies agreements, but it also raises the stakes of violation. To break a treaty is not merely political failure, it is cosmic offense. This framing discourages experimentation. Change becomes dangerous when it risks divine reprisal. As a result, systems persist beyond their usefulness, maintained out of fear rather than confidence. The human experience beneath this rigidity grows narrower. Social roles solidify. Mobility decreases for most, even as elites travel and negotiate. Knowledge becomes stratified. Those closest to temples and courts shape interpretation. Those farther away receive it as command. The earlier intimacy between observation and response dissolves almost completely, yet signs of strain surface in unexpected places. In burial practices, for example, archaeologists note shifts toward greater emphasis on personal identity, grave goods that suggest individuality, concern for the afterlife, anxiety about remembrance. These changes hint at a growing sense of impermanence. When the present feels unstable, attention turns toward what might endure beyond it. Literary texts echo this anxiety. Prayers ask not only for prosperity, but for survival. Hymns praise gods not for creation, but for restraint. There is a sense that catastrophe is no longer extraordinary, but anticipated. The future is approached cautiously, hedged with ritual and repetition, as though movement itself might provoke collapse. Against this backdrop, the memory of the earlier world takes on a different resonance. It is no longer just a contrast, it becomes a measure of loss, not a paradise, but a point of reference, a time when the world did not require constant negotiation to remain inhabitable. This memory does not inspire rebellion, but it deepens dissatisfaction. It introduces the idea that the current state of things is not the only possible outcome. The records respond to this dissatisfaction by narrowing their scope further. Origins are fixed, roles are clarified, deviations are labeled dangerous. By stabilizing narrative, the system attempts to stabilize reality. Yet the more tightly the story is held, the more brittle it becomes. Any contradiction threatens to crack it, and contradictions continue to appear. Environmental pressure does not relent. Political alliances shift unpredictably. The gods themselves, as depicted in myth, argue and regret. The image of a coherent, divinely ordered world grows harder to sustain. What remains is momentum. Cities rebuild because they must. Rituals continue because stopping them would invite uncertainty. Authority persists because alternatives feel unimaginable. The system moves forward not because it is trusted, but because there is no clear way back. This is where the tension sharpens. If the past holds a memory of balance without control, and the present reveals control without balance, then the path ahead becomes unclear. The story has not reached its breaking point yet, but the ground beneath it feels less certain with each step. The question that lingers is no longer whether collapse will come, but whether anyone will recognize it when it begins. Not as punishment or fate, but as the consequence of a choice made long before anyone remembered they had alternatives. By now, the story has learned to move forward without resolving its own contradictions. This is perhaps its most defining trait. The records continue, the cities endure, the rituals repeat, yet the sense of inevitability grows heavier. What once felt like adaptation now feels like endurance. Survival replaces orientation. The question is no longer how to live well within the world, but how to persist within structures that no longer bend. The memory of earlier balance does not disappear, but it loses its language. It can no longer be articulated as practice, only as absence. The marshes that once absorbed fluctuation are drained or constrained. The seasonal movements that once required attentiveness are replaced by schedules that assume regularity. When irregularity returns, as it always does, it is experienced as betrayal rather than reminder. The world is no longer trusted to fluctuate. It is expected to comply. This expectation reshapes human behavior in subtle ways. Risk tolerance declines, innovation becomes cautious, incremental, justified by precedent rather than necessity. When new solutions emerge, they are framed as restorations of ancient order, not departures from it. Change must disguise itself as continuity to be accepted. This disguising slows adaptation and increases fragility. Archaeological sequences reflect this tension clearly. Rebuilding phases grow more frequent but less transformative. Cities are reconstructed on the same footprints, using similar layouts, even as environmental conditions worsen. This repetition is often interpreted as resilience, yet it may also signal constraint. The imagination of alternatives has narrowed. What was built before is rebuilt again, not because it works, but because it is familiar. Texts from this period show a similar pattern. They emphasize instruction over inquiry. Ritual manuals expand. Lists of proper conduct multiply. Deviations are catalogued alongside prescribed corrections. The world is treated as something that can be stabilized through precision alone, as if enough exactness might counteract uncertainty. This belief is powerful, but it is also brittle. Precision cannot replace responsiveness. The Anunnaki remain central to this worldview, yet their presence feels increasingly symbolic. They are invoked to sanction decisions already made, to reinforce structures already in place. Their earlier ambiguity, those moments when they hesitated, argued, or regretted, is downplayed. Authority is streamlined. Complexity is smoothed over. The divine becomes less relational and more procedural. This procedural divinity mirrors the human institutions beneath it. Governance becomes formulaic. Law hardens. Enforcement intensifies. The system begins to mistake consistency for truth. What persists is assumed to be right. What fails is assumed to be wrong. There is little space left to ask whether persistence itself might be the problem. Environmental stress continues to press against this rigidity. Soil quality declines. Water management becomes increasingly difficult. Trade routes extend farther to compensate for local scarcity, increasing dependence on distant stability. When disruption occurs, through drought, conflict, or disease, the consequences cascade quickly. Interconnected systems amplify failure as easily as they once amplified growth. In such moments, the older memory flickers again, not as a solution, but as a haunting comparison. The records speak, sometimes obliquely, of a time when the world absorbed shock rather than magnified it, when communities adjusted rather than enforced, when balance emerged through restraint instead of regulation. These references are brief, almost embarrassed, as if the scribes themselves sensed how incompatible such ideas had become with the present order. The response to this incompatibility is not confrontation, but redirection. Attention turns outward, toward enemies, omens, distant lands. Expansion becomes a way to postpone reckoning. If resources can be acquired elsewhere, the limitations of the local environment need not be faced immediately. This strategy works for a time, but it carries its own costs. Each new territory introduces new variables, new tensions, new demands on an already strained system. The story continues to advance, propelled by habit and necessity rather than clarity. The foundations laid long ago, those that replaced alignment with control, remain unquestioned, even as their consequences accumulate. What began as a response to complexity has become a commitment to rigidity. The earlier world, once adaptive and fluid, now exists only as a memory too distant to guide action, yet too persistent to ignore. And so the tension remains unresolved. The records do not pause to reflect on it openly. They press forward, documenting recovery after recovery, collapse after collapse. But beneath this motion lies a stillness that feels increasingly unstable, a sense that the system is moving, not toward resolution, but toward a threshold, one that will test whether endurance alone can substitute for balance, or whether the memory of what came before will finally demand to be acknowledged in a way that cannot be contained by ritual or record. Pressure accumulates in places that records struggle to name. It does not announce itself as rebellion at first, nor as invasion or famine. It appears as fatigue woven into the ordinary. Repairs take longer, rituals feel heavier, promises sound rehearsed. The machinery of order continues to function, yet it does so with an audible strain, like a system operating beyond the conditions it was designed for. The texts respond by turning inward. Explanations grow more theological, less descriptive. When outcomes no longer align with expectation, the cause is sought not in soil or water, but in transgression and imbalance of spirit. Guilt becomes a tool for coherence. If suffering can be attributed to moral failure, then the structure itself remains intact. The alternative, that the structure may be inadequate, remains unthinkable. This inward turn reshapes how responsibility is distributed. Individuals are urged to correct themselves through devotion, restraint, and ritual exactness. Collective adaptation gives way to personal accountability. The burden of maintaining cosmic order settles on daily behavior. Small deviations acquire exaggerated significance. A missed offering, an improperly spoken word, a ritual performed out of sequence, all become potential explanations for large-scale failure. Archaeological evidence hints at the social consequences of this shift. Neighborhoods fragment, housing density changes unevenly. Some areas show signs of abandonment while others grow more crowded. These patterns suggest movement driven not by opportunity, but by pressure. People gravitating toward institutions that promise protection or explanation when conditions grow unpredictable. Proximity to authority becomes a form of security. Within this tightening circle, leadership grows more performative. Kings emphasize piety alongside power. Inscriptions proclaim devotion as loudly as conquest. Authority is displayed through visibility rather than efficacy. The message is consistent. Stability persists because the correct forms are being upheld. If instability appears, it must be because someone has failed to follow them. Yet beneath these proclamations, uncertainty deepens. The very need to insist on correctness reveals doubt. Systems that truly function do not require constant affirmation. They are trusted. Here, trust has eroded. It is replaced by repetition, by the hope that consistency alone can ward off collapse. The older memory, long contained, begins to press against this repetition in subtle ways. It appears in metaphors of return, of waters seeking their old courses, of lands remembering how to rest, of gods withdrawing not in anger, but in exhaustion. These images suggest not punishment, but saturation. A sense that the world has been over-managed, over-interpreted, asked to perform beyond its capacity. Some texts hint at this through stories of divine regret. Decisions made in councils are revisited, measures are softened, limits are introduced where none existed before. Mortality is shortened. population is reduced. These adjustments are framed as mercy. Yet they also acknowledge error. They imply that the system overshot, that restraint arrived too late. Humanity absorbs these corrections unevenly. Those with fewer resources feel them first. Lifespans shorten. Security becomes fragile. The promise of protection through obedience weakens, yet the demand for obedience intensifies. This contradiction sharpens discontent, even if it cannot be named openly. The cost of compliance rises as its benefits decline. Environmental signals continue to accumulate. Flood patterns shift. Productive land turns saline. Harvests fluctuate unpredictably. Each sign is interpreted through the existing framework, reinforcing it even as it proves insufficient. The system responds to stress by doubling down on its own logic, tightening rules when flexibility is needed most. At this stage, the story's central tension becomes unavoidable, even if it remains unspoken. The world that once functioned through alignment has been replaced by one sustained through control. Control has enabled growth, but it has also introduced fragility. The more tightly the system is held together, the more catastrophic its failures become. The records do not resolve this tension. They circle it, rephrase it, ritualize it. They offer consolation without explanation. Yet the persistence of the older memory, the insistence that there was once another way of being, prevents closure. It keeps comparison alive, even when comparison is dangerous. What emerges is not a call to abandon order, but a quiet recognition of its limits. A sense that endurance, though admirable, is not the same as balance. That survival achieved through constant correction may indicate a deeper misalignment, and that beneath the noise of ritual and decree, the world may still be signaling not for more control, but for a different kind of attention, one that was known once, long before the need to enforce it was ever named. What begins to emerge now is not collapse, but a narrowing of possibility. The world still functions, yet it does so within increasingly tight margins. Choices that once existed quietly disappear, not through prohibition, but through neglect. Paths untaken fade from memory. What remains feels inevitable, even as it grows more demanding. The records reflect this narrowing through their treatment of authority. Kingship becomes less flexible, more symbolic. Rulers present themselves as custodians of continuity rather than agents of change. Their legitimacy rests not on adaptation, but on their ability to preserve inherited forms. Innovation is permitted only when it can be framed as restoration. To alter the structure openly would be to admit that it is insufficient. This conservatism extends into religious practice. Ritual calendars grow denser. Ceremonies multiply, overlapping in purpose and symbolism. Each gesture is meant to reinforce alignment, yet the sheer volume of obligation suggests strain. When balance must be constantly reaffirmed, it is no longer self-sustaining. It requires effort simply to remain in place. The Anunnaki, in these later portrayals, appear increasingly constrained by the order they oversee. They convene, deliberate, and compromise. Decisions are made collectively, then regretted. This depiction does not diminish their power, it humanizes it. The gods are no longer distant guarantors of harmony, but participants in a system that resists correction. Their authority persists, yet it operates within limits imposed by the very structures they authorized. Human society mirrors this condition. Social roles harden. Occupations are inherited. Movement between classes becomes rare. This rigidity offers predictability, but at the cost of resilience. When circumstances change, the system struggles to respond. People know what is expected of them, but not how to adapt when expectations no longer match reality. Evidence of this struggle appears in material culture. Crafts become standardized, efficient, repetitive. Variation declines. The emphasis shifts from experimentation to consistency. This efficiency supports scale, yet it also reduces the system's capacity to absorb shock. When disruption occurs, there are fewer alternatives to draw upon. Environmental pressure continues to test these limits. The land demands rest that cannot be granted. Water requires management that exceeds available labor. Each response introduces further dependency on structure. The cycle tightens. Solutions generate new problems that require further solutions. The system grows elaborate, but not necessarily wiser. In this context, the earlier memory takes on a new role. It is no longer merely a contrast, it becomes a quiet accusation. Not that the present is wrong, but that it is incomplete, that something essential was left behind when alignment was replaced by enforcement. This memory does not propose reversal. It simply persists, asking to be acknowledged. The records respond to this persistence by reframing it as distance. The earlier world is placed beyond reach, before time was measured, before human limitation. Its difference is exaggerated until it becomes inaccessible. This framing protects the present from comparison, but it also empties the past of practical meaning. What cannot be reached cannot be learned from. Yet the cost of this dismissal becomes increasingly visible. As systems strain, as rituals multiply, as authority hardens, the sense of disconnection deepens. People perform their roles without understanding their origin. Meaning thins. What remains is obligation without orientation. This condition produces a particular kind of anxiety, one not easily expressed. It is not fear of invasion or disaster, but fear of drift. The sense that the world is being maintained, but not inhabited fully. That life is organized, but not aligned. That effort is continuous, yet satisfaction elusive. The story continues to advance through this narrowing, propelled by necessity rather than clarity. Each generation inherits a structure that feels older, heavier, more difficult to question. The past becomes something to protect rather than to understand. The future becomes something to endure rather than to imagine. And still, beneath this endurance, the earlier world lingers, not as a model to replicate, but as a reminder that existence once required less correction to remain whole. That the land once responded to attention rather than command. That balance was once a relationship, not an obligation. The records do not resolve this reminder. They move forward, carrying it silently. Yet its presence shapes everything that follows, pressing against the limits of control, waiting for the moment when the system's narrowing becomes so complete that the question it has avoided can no longer be postponed. Whether order sustained through endurance alone can truly replace a balance that once arose naturally, without being enforced at all. What follows is a quiet hardening, the kind that occurs when flexibility has already been spent. The structures remain upright, yet their movement slows. Decisions take longer, responses arrive late. What once adjusted through observation now waits for authorization. The distance between cause and response widens until it becomes almost imperceptible to those living within it. The records begin to treat stability as an achievement rather than a condition. Kings boast not of renewal, but of preservation. Inscriptions praise the maintenance of temples, the restoration of canals, the re-establishment of rights that had briefly lapsed. These acts are framed as victories, yet they also reveal a narrowing horizon. The goal is no longer to align with changing circumstances, but to hold the present in place for as long as possible. This emphasis on preservation alters how failure is perceived. When systems falter, the response is rarely to reconsider their design. Instead, effort intensifies. More labor is demanded, more offerings are prescribed, more oversight is imposed. The assumption underlying every correction is the same: that the structure is sound, and that any instability must originate elsewhere. The possibility that the framework itself has reached its limits remains excluded. Archaeological traces reflect this escalation. Repair layers grow thicker. Evidence of repeated reconstruction accumulates. Canals are dredged again and again, even as salinity worsens. Fields are replanted despite declining yields. Each intervention is precise, skilled, and increasingly insufficient. The knowledge required to sustain the system grows more specialized, yet the outcomes grow less reliable. Within this cycle, human endurance becomes central. The ability to persist replaces the ability to adapt. Suffering is reframed as virtue. Hardship is interpreted as proof of devotion. This interpretation stabilizes the system by converting strain into meaning, yet it also obscures the original source of that strain. When endurance is praised, exhaustion is normalized. The Anunnaki remain present in this logic, but their role is reduced to sanction rather than guidance. They confirm the necessity of what is already being done. Their will is cited to justify continued effort, even when effort no longer produces balance. The divine becomes an endorsement of persistence, not a source of reorientation. Literary texts from this period carry a distinct emotional tone. Laments no longer ask why suffering occurs. They ask how long it will last. The expectation of resolution diminishes. What remains is the hope of survival within known boundaries. The future is imagined as extension, not transformation. The earlier memory, still present beneath these texts, now feels distant in a different way. It is no longer contrasted with the present through abundance or harmony, but through effortlessness. The past is remembered as a time when survival did not require constant exertion. This memory does not accuse directly, but it sharpens the sense of fatigue. It introduces the idea that exhaustion itself may be a symptom, not a condition to be endured indefinitely. Environmental signals continue to echo this fatigue. Soil loses responsiveness. Water resists containment. Climatic variability increases the unpredictability of outcomes. Each signal challenges the assumption that control alone can secure continuity. Yet the response remains consistent. More control, applied with greater urgency. This pattern creates a feedback loop that is difficult to escape. The more the system strains, the more it demands from those within it. The more it demands, the less capacity remains for reflection. Reflection becomes a luxury. Action becomes compulsory. In such conditions, alternatives fade not because they are disproven, but because they cannot be afforded. The records preserve this moment with remarkable restraint. They do not declare crisis. They do not announce impending collapse. They simply continue, documenting maintenance as achievement, endurance as success. This restraint may be intentional. To name crisis would be to admit vulnerability. To admit vulnerability would be to invite reconsideration. Yet reconsideration is precisely what the earlier memory threatens to provoke. Its persistence suggests that another relationship with the world once existed, one that did not require constant reinforcement to remain intact. This suggestion grows heavier as the effort required to maintain the present increases. The story has not reached its breaking point yet, but the ground beneath it feels increasingly rigid. Movement is possible, but costly. Change can occur, but only within narrow limits. The system endures, yet it does so by consuming the very resilience that once made endurance unnecessary. And so the question sharpens, quietly but insistently. If survival now requires this much effort, if balance must be enforced rather than felt, then what is being preserved? Life itself, or merely the structure that insists on being maintained at all costs? What begins to falter next is not the structure itself, but confidence in its permanence. The records do not describe this loss directly. Instead, it surfaces through tone, through a subtle shift from assurance to insistence. Statements that once felt descriptive now feel defensive. Stability is no longer assumed. It must be asserted repeatedly, as if repetition might hold it in place. Kings respond to this unease by amplifying symbols of continuity. Lineage becomes sacred. Descent is traced carefully, linking present authority to ancient origins, even when those origins have become abstract. The past is no longer a source of guidance. It is a credential. To rule is to inherit, and to inherit is to legitimize the present by proximity rather than relevance. This emphasis on lineage has a narrowing effect. Leadership becomes less responsive to immediate conditions and more invested in maintaining inherited forms. Decisions are filtered through precedent. Novelty is treated with suspicion, not because it is dangerous in itself, but because it lacks ancestral endorsement. The future is constrained by the past's authority over imagination. Archaeological patterns reflect this shift in subtle ways. Urban layouts stabilize rigidly. Sacred precincts expand while residential areas compress. Resources flow increasingly toward institutions that represent continuity rather than toward adaptive infrastructure. Investment favors preservation over experimentation. What is ancient is reinforced. What is flexible is neglected. Within this environment, the human experience grows increasingly compartmentalized. Life is divided into prescribed roles, each with defined duties and limited scope. Identity becomes bound to function. A person is known by what they maintain rather than by how they respond. This clarity offers order, but it also limits agency. When circumstances change, roles cannot adjust easily. The Anunnaki, in their mythic portrayal, mirror this constraint. They are depicted as bound by decrees they once issued. Their authority remains vast, yet it operates within established parameters. When they intervene, it is often to correct deviations rather than to reimagine the system. Even divine power appears constrained by the weight of its own history. This mutual confinement of gods and humans alike marks a significant departure from the earlier world remembered faintly in the records. That world required attention rather than adherence. It responded to observation rather than decree. Its balance emerged through interaction, not enforcement. By contrast, the present order depends on consistency above all else. Environmental strain continues to test this dependence. Variability increases, yet the system's tolerance for deviation decreases. Floods and droughts recur, but responses are standardized, ritualized, slow. The gap between environmental rhythm and institutional reaction widens. What once would have been absorbed now accumulates. Literary texts from this period reveal a growing preoccupation with endurance. Hymns praise gods for allowing cities to persist despite adversity. Survival itself becomes the metric of success. Flourishing is no longer expected, it is remembered. This shift in expectation subtly lowers the horizon of possibility. Life is framed as something to be sustained rather than expanded. The earlier memory, still present beneath the surface, now feels almost incompatible with the present. Its suggestion of ease and responsiveness contrasts sharply with a world defined by effort and rigidity. Yet this contrast is rarely articulated. To do so would invite comparison, and comparison would invite doubt. Instead, the memory is contained within mythic distance. It is assigned to a time when humans were different, when gods acted directly, when the rules had not yet hardened. This framing protects the present from critique, but it also strips the past of practical relevance. What once functioned becomes unimaginable, and yet the persistence of this memory suggests it cannot be fully erased. It continues to surface in moments of strain, when systems fail to respond, when effort yields diminishing returns. In those moments, the question returns, not as rebellion, but as quiet uncertainty. If endurance has replaced balance, and preservation has replaced alignment, then what happens when endurance itself begins to falter? The story moves forward, carried by habit and necessity. The structures hold for now, but the confidence that once animated them has thinned. What remains is momentum, powerful, deliberate, and increasingly difficult to redirect. The path ahead feels narrower than ever, shaped less by choice than by the accumulated weight of decisions made long ago, when alternatives were still visible, and balance did not yet require constant defense. The narrowing reaches a point where movement itself begins to feel precarious. Change is no longer resisted openly, it is avoided quietly. Decisions are delayed, responses are softened. What cannot be maintained is postponed rather than confronted. The system does not collapse, but it hesitates, and that hesitation spreads through every layer of life. In the records, this hesitation appears as ambiguity. Decrees grow cautious. Language becomes layered with conditional phrases and ritual safeguards. Nothing is stated without protection. Every action is hedged against potential failure. This carefulness suggests not wisdom, but fear. Fear that the structures holding the world together may no longer respond as expected. Political authority reflects this uncertainty. Kings rule, but their confidence feels strained. Inscriptions emphasize vigilance rather than triumph. Borders are defended more aggressively, even as internal cohesion weakens. Loyalty must be reaffirmed repeatedly, as if it no longer arises naturally from shared purpose. Power persists, but it feels brittle. Archaeological layers hint at this brittleness through signs of fragmentation. Some districts show careful maintenance, while others decay. Public spaces shrink. Defensive architecture expands inward. The city turns its attention toward protection rather than participation. Life becomes oriented around preservation, not exchange. Economic patterns shift accordingly. Trade continues, but it becomes more strategic. more guarded. Resources are stockpiled rather than circulated. Scarcity is anticipated even when abundance remains possible. This anticipation alters behavior. When people expect loss, they act defensively, reinforcing the very instability they fear. The Anunnaki, in the narratives of this period, appear increasingly distant. Their judgments are invoked, yet their presence feels abstract. They are no longer described as walking among humans or shaping events directly. Instead, they function as principles, embodied justifications for decisions already made. Their authority remains unquestioned, but it no longer reassures. This distance affects how catastrophe is understood. When disaster strikes, it is interpreted as confirmation of long-held anxiety rather than interruption. Floods, droughts, invasions, each is absorbed into the narrative of inevitable strain. The response is resignation tempered by ritual, not surprise. The extraordinary becomes expected. Literary texts capture this mood through subdued lamentation. The tone is less accusatory, more weary. The question is no longer who is at fault, but whether endurance will be enough. Appeals to the gods ask for reprieve rather than restoration. The horizon has narrowed to survival within familiar bounds. Against this backdrop, the memory of the earlier world takes on a haunting quality. It is no longer remembered as something lost suddenly, but as something that faded gradually, almost unnoticed. A way of living that required less vigilance, less explanation, less effort to sustain. Its absence is felt not as grief but as fatigue. This fatigue shapes the human experience profoundly. People fulfill obligations, perform rituals, maintain structures, yet the sense of purpose thins. Meaning becomes procedural. Correctness replaces connection. The world is managed but no longer inhabited with ease. Environmental conditions continue to press against this fatigue. Variability intensifies. The land responds unpredictably. Each deviation demands attention, yet attention alone cannot restore responsiveness. The system's rigidity amplifies stress rather than absorbing it. At this stage, the central tension of the story sharpens into quiet inevitability. A world sustained through control has reached the limits of what control can achieve, not because authority has failed, but because authority cannot replace relationship indefinitely. The records do not announce this realization. They move forward, documenting effort with remarkable composure. Yet beneath the composure lies a sense that something fundamental is giving way, not suddenly, but persistently. The question that lingers now is no longer about what was lost long ago, but about what happens when the structures built to compensate for that loss can no longer compensate themselves, and the memory of balance once distant begins to feel uncomfortably relevant again. The ground begins to shift in ways that records struggle to contain, not through a single rupture, but through accumulation, small failures aligning until they resemble inevitability. The system still functions, yet it does so unevenly, as if different parts of the world are no longer moving at the same pace. What once held together through shared rhythm now relies on constant adjustment to avoid tearing. Texts from this stage reveal an increasing preoccupation with restoration. Cities are said to be renewed, temples purified, order re-established. The language suggests return, yet the returns never last. Each restoration requires another. Each repair assumes a prior state that cannot be fully recovered. The present becomes a series of approximations rather than a continuation. Archaeological layers echo this pattern. Rebuilding phases grow shorter, more frequent, less ambitious. Materials are reused. Walls rise where streets once opened. The architecture of openness gives way to the architecture of containment. These choices speak not of confidence, but of retreat. The city turns inward, conserving what remains rather than projecting stability outward. Political authority adapts to this retreat by narrowing its claims. Kings emphasize guardianship rather than expansion. Their role is to hold what exists together, not to envision something new. Law becomes increasingly detailed, specifying correct behavior for ever smaller circumstances. This precision gives the appearance of order, yet it also reveals fragmentation. When coherence must be enforced at such granularity, it is already compromised. The Anunnaki, as portrayed in later narratives, appear increasingly constrained by necessity. They deliberate longer. Their decisions carry hesitation. Sometimes they withdraw rather than intervene, as if aware that intervention itself may deepen imbalance. This portrayal introduces a quiet irony. The beings once associated with management now seem overwhelmed by what they manage. Human experience reflects this irony closely. Responsibility expands even as agency contracts. People are expected to uphold the system through exact adherence, yet they have little influence over its direction. This imbalance breeds resignation. Effort continues, but expectation diminishes. Life becomes a sequence of obligations fulfilled without anticipation of lasting reward. Environmental stress compounds this resignation. Droughts linger. Floods return unpredictably. Soil quality declines further. Each disruption strains resources already stretched thin. The system responds predictably, with more regulation, more ritual, more insistence on correctness. The pattern repeats, reinforcing itself. The memory of the earlier world now presses closer to the surface, not as nostalgia, but as comparison. Its defining feature is no longer abundance or harmony, but responsiveness, a sense that the world once answered attention directly, without requiring layers of interpretation or enforcement. This comparison unsettles because it suggests that much of the current effort is compensatory rather than necessary. Literary texts hint at this unease through imagery of distance. Gods retreat to the heavens. Sacred spaces grow more exclusive. Communication becomes mediated through signs and specialists. Direct relationship fades. What remains is representation, symbols standing in for connections no longer accessible. This mediation affects how meaning is experienced. Rituals continue, yet their emotional resonance thins. Words are spoken correctly, but without expectation of transformation. The system relies on form to preserve itself, even as form loses the power to renew. The difference between compliance and alignment grows stark. At this point, the story approaches a threshold without naming it. The accumulation of strain, the narrowing of possibility, the persistence of an unarticulated alternative all converge. The question is no longer whether the system can endure, but what endurance now means. Survival has replaced balance as the measure of success. The records move forward with restraint, avoiding conclusions. They do not declare an end, because the end does not arrive cleanly. It arrives as continuation under altered conditions. The world does not stop. It becomes harder to inhabit. What once flowed now resists. What once adjusted now fractures. And in this resistance, The memory of what existed before the Anunnaki arrived, before management replaced alignment, feels closer than ever. Not as a destination, but as a reminder. A reminder that systems built to compensate for loss may eventually confront the limits of compensation itself, and that when they do, the silence they once preserved may begin to speak again, demanding attention not through command, but through consequence. The silence begins to change texture. It no longer feels like absence, but like pressure waiting for release. The records grow thinner here, not because less is happening, but because less can be explained within the existing language. Events continue. Cities weaken, alliances fracture, populations move. But the narrative framework that once absorbed disruption now struggles to contain it. Inscriptions from this period emphasize continuity with an almost ritualistic intensity. Kings repeat the names of predecessors. Temples reaffirm ancient dedications. The past is invoked constantly, not as memory, but as validation. To act is to claim inheritance. To rule is to stand within an unbroken line. Yet the insistence itself suggests fragility. Continuity must be declared because it can no longer be felt. Archaeological evidence mirrors this dissonance. Some cities show signs of hurried fortification, others of gradual abandonment. There is movement without direction, people leaving familiar ground without clear destinations. Trade routes falter, not through collapse, but through hesitation. Exchange becomes sporadic. Networks loosen. The connective tissue of the world thins. This thinning alters how risk is perceived. Where uncertainty once invited adaptation, it now provokes withdrawal. Communities retreat into what remains controllable. Ritual intensifies within shrinking boundaries. The outside world grows threatening, not because it has changed dramatically, but because the system's ability to respond has diminished. The Anunnaki, once central to explanations, recede further into abstraction. Their names are still spoken, their authority still acknowledged, yet their role feels increasingly symbolic. They are no longer described as deciding the course of events, but as witnessing them. The burden of endurance shifts almost entirely onto human structures. Literary texts from this stage reflect a deep ambivalence. They speak of renewal while describing decay. They praise stability while recording loss. The contradiction is not resolved, it is sustained. The story continues because stopping would require naming what has become unspeakable. That the system built to preserve order may no longer be capable of doing so. Environmental signals reinforce this tension relentlessly. Climatic variability increases, agricultural predictability declines. Each season demands recalculation. The margin for error narrows until even small disruptions carry outsized consequences. The system, optimized for control, lacks the elasticity to absorb surprise. In this environment, the memory of the earlier world becomes almost unbearable, not because it promises escape, but because it exposes contingency. It suggests that the present order is not the only way humans have lived with the land, nor the most resilient. This suggestion threatens the logic that has sustained authority for generations. Yet the memory cannot be articulated fully. It remains diffuse, embedded in metaphors of return and withdrawal, in reverence for ancient waters and forgotten mounds. It is acknowledged indirectly, carefully, as if naming it outright might unravel the narrative that holds everything together. The human experience within this tension is marked by quiet resignation. People continue their roles not because they expect restoration, but because continuity itself has become a moral obligation. To endure is to be faithful. To question is to risk collapse. Meaning is drawn from persistence rather than possibility. This is where the story approaches its most precarious balance. Not the balance of harmony, but the balance of strain. The point at which effort and outcome diverge so sharply that endurance becomes indistinguishable from erosion. The system has not failed, yet it no longer convinces. It functions, yet it no longer reassures. The records do not announce what comes next. They simply continue, thinner and more cautious, as if aware that the language they rely on may not survive the weight it carries. Beneath the surface of continuity, something fundamental is loosening, not dramatically, not violently, but persistently. And in that loosening, the question returns with renewed urgency. If the world before the Anunnaki functioned through alignment rather than control, and if the structures built to replace that alignment are now fraying, then what remains to hold meaning together when continuity itself becomes the heaviest burden of all? What remains at the far edge of this long movement is not a resolution, but a thinning, of certainty, of language, of explanation. The records do not end with collapse, they fade into transition. Power shifts hands. Cities contract and reappear elsewhere. Names change, titles endure. The world continues, but not in the form it once recognized as stable. Later scribes will inherit fragments of what came before, arranging them into cleaner sequences, firmer origins, safer beginnings. The pauses will be shortened. The silences will be smoothed. What once lingered as uncertainty will be reframed as myth, and myth will be placed at a comfortable distance from history. The Anunnaki will become figures of belief rather than memory, their arrival transformed into a starting point instead of a turning point. Yet beneath that rearrangement, something essential will persist. The sense that the story did not truly begin where it claims to. That beneath kingship, beneath temples, beneath divine administration, there existed a way of living that required less enforcement to remain whole. This sense will survive not as instruction, but as unease. A feeling that the foundations are older, quieter, and more difficult to name than the narratives built upon them. The Sumerian records, read carefully, never deny this. They preserve it indirectly, through what they choose not to explain, through their insistence that order preceded authority, through their repeated acknowledgement of a time before management became necessary, through their refusal to describe that time in detail, as if detail itself would distort something too fragile to formalize. What happened before the Anunnaki arrived is not recorded as an event. It is recorded as a condition, a world aligned rather than regulated, a balance maintained through attention instead of command, a relationship between land, water, and life that did not require constant correction to endure. This is not presented as a paradise, nor as a goal to be reclaimed. It is presented as context, a reminder that the structures we inherit are responses, not inevitabilities. The warning, if there is one, does not arrive as prophecy. It arrives as pattern. Systems built to replace alignment with control can succeed for long periods. They can produce cities, knowledge, art, and power. But they also introduce fragility that accumulates quietly beneath the appearance of continuity. When that fragility reaches its limits, endurance alone cannot restore what was never designed to be permanent. The Sumerian scribes did not resolve this tension. They carried it forward. They allowed contradiction to stand. They recorded authority alongside regret, order alongside lament, beginnings alongside loss. In doing so, they left behind something more enduring than certainty. A question. Not a question about gods descending or civilizations rising, but a question about balance itself, about whether control can ever fully replace relationship, about whether systems meant to stabilize life can forget the conditions that once made stability unnecessary, about what is lost when memory is preserved as record, but not as practice. As the story settles into silence, nothing asks to be believed. Nothing asks to be concluded. The records remain, patient and incomplete, inviting not agreement, but attention. They suggest that history does not only move forward, it narrows, widens, forgets, and remembers, often without realizing which it is doing, and perhaps that is the final thought to carry into the quiet. That the earliest loss remembered by the Sumerians was not divine departure or human failure, but the gradual forgetting of how to live within the world without first needing to control it. Whether that forgetting is permanent remains unanswered. The tablets do not say. They simply endure, waiting for each new listener to decide what it means to remember what came before the story began. Thank you for spending this quiet stretch of time with Cryptic Realm Channel. What you've heard tonight was not meant to solve the past, nor to replace one certainty with another. It was meant to slow the way we listen to history, to notice the pauses, the silences, and the choices hidden beneath familiar stories. The Sumerian records do not tell us exactly what happened before the Anunnaki arrived. Instead, they leave us with something more subtle. The awareness that civilization began not only with creation, but with substitution, loss, and adaptation. If this journey has left you with questions rather than conclusions, then it has done its work. History, especially at its deepest edges, does not exist to reassure us. It exists to widen our sense of time, to soften our confidence in simple origins, and to remind us that what we inherit is often only a fragment of what once was. Here, we explore histories that whisper instead of shout, civilizations shaped by water, memory, and silence, stories that invite reflection rather than belief. If this way of approaching the past brings you calm, curiosity, or a sense of quiet wonder, you are always welcome to return. Until our next journey into obscured time, rest well, and let the unanswered questions keep their gentle watch.